Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 8th IdentityNORTH webinar. Our mandate here at IdentityNORTH is to educate Canadians, to connect key players, and promote Canadian innovations and organizations. And now really focusing on urgently driving change and driving action to change this way that we are interacting online. Today is the very first time we've done a digital kind of live broadcast at the same time, and all having us at the same place at the same time. So this is pretty cool. I'm super glad to get a chance to do this with you guys, showcase a great example of leadership, innovation in this field. I'm Aaron Hamilton. I'm the chair of IdentityNORTH, and I'm the host of the IdentityNORTH podcast. Broadcasting mostly live here today. We might throw away to someone that's on the other side of the world here. That's right. But joining me here in our studio is our two guests from ForgeRock. So Damien Flannery, a major account executive, and Keith Lax, principal solution architect from ForgeRock. So we've talked to these guys a few times in the past, and I really wanted to circle back because one of the things that keeps coming up is the fact that it's hard to get started, and there's a lot of legacy systems that have to get transformed, and a lot of legacy data that has to get transformed. And as we go to shift, make these big shifts to getting ready for kind of tomorrow's identity platforms, it seems that we really need to kind of lay the foundation for being part of this new emerging identity ecosystem. But moving from this situation where a ton of data is locked up in these legacy systems, and a lot of us just can't even imagine how to get started. So Damon and Keith talked to us a little bit about this live at IdentityNORTH in Ottawa, and I wanted to go into it a little bit more detail today. And we're going to have a little bit more time at the end of these gentlemen speaking to do a little bit of a Q&A. So you'll see at the bottom of your screen there's a Q&A button, so you can go ahead and submit questions on that way. So why don't we kick off? You guys tell us a little bit about what you're working on right now, and take us through it.
Sure. So yeah, thank you, Aaron. And it's fun to actually be here live and have us all in the same room. So we've got a pretty neat initiative underway that we're doing it from a modernization perspective. So right now, what we're focusing on is really helping get clients off of some of those legacy systems and giving them a bit of a roadmap and a place to start. So the goal of what we're doing with Project Miami is really all around modernizing identity and access management solutions and systems.
Miami.
Project Miami.
It's where we all want to be when it's snowing in Toronto.
Who doesn't want to be? Exactly. Who doesn't want to be part of Project Miami?
All right.
So Miami has to do with modernizing identity, and then really what we're going to do today is go through. We're going to start with a successful case study, so we can hear how it went, who's done it, how well it's gone, and then we're going to get into the steps that we like to give our clients as a starting point.
I love running in these projects, in these conversations with the idea of a case study, because it really helps us understand, someone's actually done it, and understand. Hopefully, you're going to admit to some of the things you could have done better, and want to fix for next time, not just how awesome it was. But let's go.
All right, sure, sounds good. Let me kick off the presentation, please. Awesome. All right, so Keith and I are kind of going to go back and forth a little bit. We split it up so that we are changing the person speaking to keep everyone's attention. But what we're going to do today is really kind of making this move to a modern identity and access management platform. So the next slide. I think we all know who we are, and there's the three of us. Alan is also going to join probably by video, by sound clip a little bit later on in the session as well. So first slide, I'm going to hand over to Keith, and Keith's going to kind of walk us through the evolution of identity.
Yeah, thanks, Damien. So what we wanted to do today is, we're not going to be talking specifically about ForgeRock. What we wanted to do is just give a little bit of insight into the conversations we have across the industry. And where a lot of this starts is around the evolution of identity, of what we've seen over the last 5, 10, 15 years. Whereas in the past, where we saw around 20 years ago, it was largely an internal driven use case, mostly based on single sign-on, right? And as we go further down the path where we start introducing third parties, contractors, partners, more to the IAM conversation, we see the shift in the backend technology going away from just web application servers, more to API-driven conversations, more to being microservices infrastructures driven and around a single unified experience, these kind of things. And now that we start moving into the IoT conversations, performance and scalability starts to be front and center to a lot of these conversations. So the flip side of this
idea being that you need to real time and has to be able to kind of live, and you're expecting immediate responses to these things.
Absolutely. So it'd be very short response times required, and the sheer scale, right? Where you're talking millions of users, billions of sessions, tens of billions of identities tied to those. So when we start to see charts like this, the first things that customers often ask us is the back-end complexity required.
Right.
And that's the initial hurdle that they're facing, right? They've got all these legacy systems, just like you said. Now they're probably hit some sort of compelling event around performance requirements or trying to move to the cloud, one of those types of conversations.
Right.
And across the industry, all the big vendors are trying to get there with a good story of say, how do we reduce complexity from a deployment perspective, from an integration perspective, from an end user experience perspective? That's where we're really trying to focus. And so that's where we've got a lot of good case studies. For example, I'll let Damien take the one coming up here around Richmond.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe one last thing before we jump off this too. It's one thing to say that we need to be connected real time and we have to be able to respond quickly. But the other thing too that we see with these projects is they can't be 10-year projects, right? Nobody wants to undertake an identity management project that's going to be a 3-year cycle. Spend all this money up front and you're doing nothing but chasing a win. So that's another part of the evolution that we've seen is the evolution of the project itself.
No, it totally makes sense. We need quick wins. We need to show that that the basics can work, and then we can expand upon that. But let's show that we've achieved something right off the bat.
Exactly. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the City of Richmond. The City of Richmond actually fits in pretty well with that scale that we just looked at. When they started doing what they were doing for providing citizens with online access to services, what happened was every one of these different groups broke off into silos. They all started building their own systems. They all started building their own websites. Every one of them had separate login accounts. Every one of them had different credentials, different ways of authenticating, different ways of communicating back and forth with the city. And that was a big problem. So what they heard from citizens is, it's great. Every time you roll out a new online service, you roll out a new account. So it becomes really difficult for me to interact with you, and I can't keep track of all these usernames, passwords.
Yeah, this doesn't sound fun as an end user.
Yeah, and then why do I need to give you a username password just to see the garbage collection cycle? Some of that information is not sensitive. Some of it should be able to easily access without having to go log on to some silo system to do that. Not only was it siloed systems, but the complexity was high. So it was difficult to manage, difficult to maintain. There was a lot of work to have all of these groups build these systems, but then not talk to each other at all. So when one would upgrade or one would deploy something, it would be done in a silo and they wouldn't really be communicating. So as a citizen perspective, the experience is very difficult to work with.
Okay.
So what they did is they took a pretty simple approach. They talked about a quick win. They created the My Richmond portal. So now citizens could log into one portal, access their services easily by clicking on a single website, the same look and feel across those websites, the same way to interact with the city. And it was a lot easier for them to interact and give feedback as to what they liked and didn't like.
Right.
From a complexity perspective, they started leveraging microservices, a microservices architecture for the solution. So that really helped them with the speed of deployment. So they weren't waiting years, months to be able to do these deployments. They're able to do things in weeks, quickly turn out services, quickly add new functionality, listen to the feedback of their citizens and deploy these services a lot quicker. This really gave them the ability to develop a digital ecosystem, right? And allowed them to have this concept of privilege. What should be protected? What shouldn't be protected?
Okay.
How do we go about securing these services? Which ones require logon? And which one is just information that we're gonna be able to share with our citizens? And then by communicating, they're actually able to pull all these municipal services into one single location, enable single sign-on for the end users, but also be able to use that data across the different silos they had before and get a better understanding of what each of these departments was actually trying to do. So what they, finally what they really saw is they doubled their citizen adoption. So it really, they were able to do a quick win by deploying the My Richmond and also see the results of that quick win by watching the user count double.
So more people were accessing the services that they were trying to communicate out presumably because it was easier to use and
right.
less hurdles, right?
Right.
Is it more, is it the same number of people using it twice as much, or is it even like more people?
No, it's more people using it for sure. It's absolutely more people using it, but they're also seeing the consumption of the services are also increasing. So,
Very good.
So yeah, it's a good story. They actually submitted this work, this My Richmond, to there was a contest for kind of the most innovative cities across Canada, and they ended up ending up in the top 20 of that result as well.
Okay.
So they got some accolades for what they've done as well. So overall, it's a great experience.
Very nice.
Slide. So now what we're going to do is really kind of cover off a little bit more, and we forgot to take the build out of this one. So we're going to have to click through a little bit to build those slides out as they grow. Keep going, yeah. So Keith is gonna take this slide and talk a little bit about how we view the IT department before and how it looks now.
Yeah, thanks. So this talks to one, I think, what the City of Richmond went through, and what we were talking about before is around a bit the evolution, right? So traditionally, when we were talking that IT department view, which was mostly around single sign-on, a little bit of access control, largely SAML driven, even that came a little bit later, to a more modern approach, which is really driven around context. And context becomes more and more important as you start to understand the richness of those policy decisions, right? The more context you know about the identity, the more I understand about Damien, the more I can drive those access-driven decisions.
Right.
And so historically, we would have had a divergence of your internal use cases, which is application service single sign-on, and your consumer use cases, like you kind of see in IT department versus the more modern approach, which is API-driven and user experience-driven. Now, those have come back together.
Right.
Your typical employee is now treated much more often like a consumer these days, right? They need streamlined provisioning.
Okay.
They're using cloud-based services,
right,
much like a consumer-type application. And so from the front end, we see customers talking to us all the time around single unified experience. They need to reduce friction. That's the name of the game. I want to take all the friction that I can and push it to the end of the process, right? And we talk a little bit about that through the tool set that we provide. And then on the back end, we have questions around using on-premise, private cloud, public clouds, hybrid clouds. Where do I deploy it? How do I streamline that? Because it's no longer just about how do I deploy it today, right? It's how can I use the tool sets to have an elastic infrastructure?
Right.
I need to increase the load horizontally based on the load and peak times, based on Black Friday sales, etc. Right? And what are the tool sets I can use to do that? So that's now where we see the chart more on the right, that it's a lot more interconnected across omni-channel devices, partners, employees, customers. There's a lot more overlap. And so the tools need to reflect that, right? And we're going to a modern infrastructure. So this slide talks to the number of challenges that we typically face when we're looking at a new project, right? And these probably aren't going to surprise anybody on today's webinar, would be my guess, right? And that speaks to the technology in terms of the foundation of these challenges has been around for a long time, right? The enhancements that we've seen and where the customers want to go with a modern approach is more around reducing the complexity, right? We know I can deploy 1,000 web servers and make that handle those large deployments, but that's not a practical approach, right? We need to have a better tool set to be able to get that elastic growth. We need to introduce DevOps processes. We need to have a better microservices architecture, these kind of things. And so when we look at these challenges, the modern approach addresses them in a number of different ways. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about over the next couple slides, is how can I use an access manager engine, which is policy driven? How do I feed that engine with the best gas possible, which is around identity and data, right? To get better decisions made. And where do I store that data? Is it going to be in a scalable directory, database, et cetera? And how do I tie those things together? And that helps customers get over that initial hurdle that we keep seeing as saying, look, I've got this big problem of legacy infrastructure. What's the first step? And we don't want to boil the ocean. We want to have quick wins where we can start with a streamlined migration, go more to slice and dice the applications so it's completely frictionless for your end users. That type of approach seems to resonate a lot more.
Okay.
So last but not least, this is a quick snapshot we talk to when we're talking about context. And it's important, and you see context come up more and more in a lot of these slides and a lot of IAM conversations, especially when you start looking at analyst reports, right? modern infrastructure, architecture documents, this idea of understanding a digital identity is really, really important, right? We see the common, we'll say, buzzword use cases like know your customer,
Right.
for example, right? Those buzzwords are driven by how do I control this identity? How do I know, and what's the source of truth for their purchase history versus their profile information versus maybe their employee information, all these things tied together and used in a meaningful way to drive those policy decisions. And so that tool set is what ForgeRock really tries to help with. And I think that's where IAM as an industry is really going, right? Is to give that back end plumbing combined with a front end streamlined approach so that it's easy for end users and it's easy for administrators and infrastructure engineers to actually get this stuff going and running in a meaningful way.
Yeah, because I mean, when you look at this slide and you look at the slide on the right, the first thing that jumps to mind is, wow, that's complex. How am I going to write a policy to be able to do everything that's listed out there?
That's exactly what I was thinking. And it's going to change over time, right? Because these things are, first of all, the relationships are going to change. And second of all, the types of relationships are going to change. I see down the road, like, I'm not going to necessarily own, like you're talking in here about owning a car or using a car. Not that long, we're not going to be owning cars anymore, right? So
yeah. And it's, I mean, we've done things where, I mean, you can look at a company who has issued an RFP just 3 years ago compared to an RFP they issue today, and the drastic differences in requirements that they want to be able to leverage, right? This is quickly evolving stuff. So the tools that you're putting into production, that you're investing in today, it needs to be able to be quickly adaptable. One, from an end user perspective, but also from an integration perspective, right? A deployment perspective. The release cycles now, we're talking days and weeks. Right? I need to be able to do a new release of my cloud service every week with new features and new updates. I need to have the tools to be able to do that. Not this 1 year maintenance cycle, right? That customers are used to doing on some of the more legacy infrastructures.
That's good. Can I find out how we find out about this robot that's going to be assisting with the house? Because that seems to be a key one that's missing in my life.
I know, that'd be nice. The robot butler. Around the corner.
Oh, there was a build there. All right, so I'm going to switch back over to me. So you've heard us talk about, the evolution of identity. You've heard us talk about a successful case study, and then Keith spent some time talking about some of the foundational information that relates to modern identity approach. So now we're going to jump into a little bit of the cookbook approach. Like, how do we do this? It's great. We showed you what the end result was. We showed you some of the information we did to get there. But what we're going to cover now in the next few slides is really how you go about implementing a modern identity approach. So we talked about earlier in the session today, where do you start? What do you do? So really, that's what this slide is all about. This is what the circle is all about. So, the first thing you want to get into really is, in this next slide here, is really jumping into simplify. So we've heard it's complex, difficult to use from an end user perspective, difficult to deploy, maintain. So the first goal of your modern identity approach should be to simplify. You've got to have a lightweight deployment. It's got to be easy to do. It's got to be less infrastructure. It's got to be quick and simple to deploy. You definitely want to get rid of the friction from the user perspective. The number one piece of feedback that we get from clients all the time is that the users don't like using the system. It's difficult. Passwords, privileges, how we even get access to the various pieces of the infrastructure, it's difficult. So you want to lower that friction. Obviously, cost has to be a driver too. Like, the days of spending millions and millions of dollars on any project is not where modern identity is evolving to. So you've got to be able to show lower total cost of ownership and be able to quickly identify that cost of ownership and show the value in the solutions that you're rolling out. And last but not least, as much as we'd all like to get away from the legacy systems, we can't. The legacy systems are going to be there. They add value. We just want to provide an easier way for our users to connect and interact with them.
So it's about the connection layer then.
It's about the connection layer and simplifying that piece.
And this becomes really important, especially with the context conversation, because we look at some of the more modern challenges around CARTA, zero trust, these types of frameworks, right? Which is all around continual risk assessment, continual authentication, and the same type of hurdles that the customers are facing is this is all a great idea, but it sounds really complex. How do I go and continually reevaluate a session to do some sort of risk assessment? Well, the tool set around simplification helps a lot, right? Making it an easy graphical experience, being able to have the right monitoring in place to make these assessments, get the right signals into your system. All that is part of the simplification approach.
Yeah, and if you go back to your analogy of the gas that's in the tank that drives this, right? So the data is there. The information about the user is there. So instead of constantly asking him questions and trying to determine what they're trying to do, use what's already at your disposal. And that's what this continuous evaluation is doing, is using that data to make as many decisions as possible and removing that friction from the user. Don't push anything down to them until you have to.
Is there a sense that you still have to make some changes to the legacy backend? Because, for example, a system that was built in the 60s, 70s, maybe even 80s and 90s may have just had, two fields for gender, right? And like, that's just not the world that we live in. And so the legacy system is, imposing, restrictions that just are not reasonable these days. So it strikes me that, as much as we want to build on top of them, part of us wants to throw them out because they do restrict us. So how do we get around that with this kind of a system?
I'll give you the easy architect answer is to say it depends.
Of course.
Okay. But usually it's a mix and match, to be honest. So you're right. Some legacy applications, whether it's native capabilities are, I hate to say old, but maybe just lacking or limited, right? And we have some tools to help with that in terms of gateways and proxies, ways that we can handle the plumbing on the back end to push and massage the data to make it fit more modern use cases. And so we have tools to do that with Identity Gateway or an Identity Manager type product. Sometimes it can be, we'll say, I hate to say customization, but heavy configuration of those back-end apps, right?
Sure.
Those legacy apps could be, adding that to just changing that front-end web page and then change the data fields on the back end, that kind of thing. We see all types. And typically, especially in large enterprises, governments, large banks, that's why I say mix and match. I think the 80-20 rule often does apply, where you're going to find one or two buckets that fits 80% of your applications. There's going to be 20% that tend to be outliers. And that's where you start to have the Swiss Army knife conversations and say, okay, what APIs can I use? How do I do this? And what you want to look at as someone looking at these solutions, whether it's going to be a good fit, is where are the hooks?
And it strikes me that, so someone could hear your answer and say, well, forget about it. I just want to start all over. But the point is that that's not going to work either, because you're just bringing today's perspective. And maybe if you started, in the late 80s, it would have been like male, female, other. And now we'd have, we might have a longer list. And there's no point in trying to, lock these things down to one point in time and one perspective. They need to be flexible. And what you're kind of talking to me about here, it sounds like, is adding that layer of flexibility that will be sustainable.
Right. It needs to be adaptable, sustainable, exactly. And that's why in IAM in general, I think it's really important to have a framework that has a lot of hooks exposed.
So they can be adaptable over time.
Exactly. So they can plug into different things easily, so that it's not a stove type approach where you're going to be ripping out whole chunks of things to try and plug in something else, but where you can just tweak what needs to be tweaked.
Absolutely. All right. So we talked about simplifying. That's great, but secure. Everyone knows that secure is one of the top priorities that everyone is looking at right now. You want to make sure that as you open up these hooks and you expose all of these elements out there to make it more flexible and adaptable, well, you've actually exposed a larger attack surface as well. So you're exposing your vulnerabilities at the same time as exposing pieces that are going to help you be adaptable. So you've got to be able to understand the context and relationship information that's coming in, interpret it in such a way where you can make appropriate security decisions. So security should always be front of mind. You should always be looking at how you can go about using the data and information that you have to protect those key components and those key pieces. You really want to look at as we've talked about, the zero trust model, right? So the whole concept of being able to say, let's start with we don't know who you are. So rather than give you access, let's figure out who you are. So let's not really give you anything until we've figured out who you are, we've determined what you're trying to do, and we've related that to the context of the systems that you're trying to access. And now we can start to make some decisions and continuously evaluate that information so that we can make, again, a frictionless decision that's helping pull some of that security away from the user. So you're increasing security, but you're not increasing the burden on the end users themselves. Okay. And then the other thing that you're trying to do here is really you want to empower users nowadays. The days of people just having access to your data and you having no say in it, those days are gone, right? You need to be able, you want to know who has access to your data. Right. You want to control how they access it, when they access it, and who they're sharing it with, right? So empowering your users to be able to be a part of the security model, a part of the decision tree to determine who gets access to what data is also a very important part of a modern identity solution.
Makes sense.
And then regular upkeep. We've talked about the days of these giant security patches get rolling out, and organizations would say, okay, we're going to do these patches once a quarter. So every 3 months we're rolling out these security patches, and the system will be down for X amount of time. Well, you can't be doing that anymore, right? The new solutions, that's why it's based on, microservices architectures. You're streamlining, you're simplifying. And by doing that, you've got the ability to really quickly and keep up with the security pieces there. You're improving your security posture in a much more timely manner.
That makes sense. It's got to be live real time, right?
Exactly. All right, so next thing we got to talk about when you're looking at a modern approach is scale, right? So the days of knowing I've got 5,000 users and that's what my threshold's going to be, so you go off and you build your system, those days and requirements aren't there anymore. So you've got to be able to understand that a successful solution is going to have to scale to millions of users, right? So you've got to be able to not build this thing for 1 million users day one, but build it in such a way that you understand that you have to get to that scale. The solution has to be flexible and adaptable to be able to handle the load that you're going to get, to handle the Black Fridays and millions of people showing up on a 48-hour period, and the next thing you know, the system goes back down to normal usage, right? So you've got to be able to understand the scale of what you're trying to accomplish with the project and build a system in such a way that can adapt with it.
And this, when we talk about scale, I would urge anyone on the webinar to, when they're talking to vendors, is to ask around DevOps. Mm-hmm. That's a really key piece on this conversation, right? Is how can I automate the deployment of this infrastructure so I can look at and monitor the peak usage times, automatically deploy additional services as needed, and then shrink it back. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. They should be able, and that's from configuration all the way through, right? And that's a really important piece of the conversation. And you see a lot out there of saying, well, I'm DevOps enabled, which means, they'll give you some Docker blueprints and there you go, right? But there's a lot more to that. Right. And so I would urge everyone out there to sort of ask that question, because I find a year, 2, 3 years ago, it hardly came up at all. Now DevOps is in every single conversation I have. Absolutely. It's a really important piece of the conversation, especially in the IAM use case. Mm-hmm. So absolutely, it's an important piece.
And then the other thing that I would say on the flip side of this is also, you've got to know what your user community is going to look like. So ask the questions. How many people are we looking at? What's the transaction loads going to be? What's the expected response time? I mean, we've all been to a website or access an application where you click on a button, nothing happens. So you click multiple times because you're getting frustrated. You expect a response.
Never happened to me.
Yeah.
Then you get 6 TVs show up on your door, right?
Then you get 6 TVs on your store, yeah. It actually happened to me on Black Friday. I had 3 orders showed up because I clicked yes.
Seriously?
Yeah. So I had to log a ticket. Now, don't worry, it's going to get refunded. But so all that to say, be aware of your user population, understand what your performance expectations are, and then adapt the system to be able to adhere to that. So. Right. And then the last piece of this circle that we had, the cake that we were building and the recipe that goes behind it, has to do with extending. So we've touched on this throughout the whole conversation, right? You've got to be able to extend. You've got to be cloud ready. You've got to be not just cloud ready, but cloud ready, multiple vendor cloud ready. You can't say our solution will work on cloud XYZ, but not cloud ABC. You've got to really build a solution that's based on open standards, understands the concepts behind extending, and being able to plug in and integrate with that. So you want to be able to ask the vendors the questions. Can you run in any cloud? How do you run in any cloud? Are there restrictions with that? So you want to be able to understand.
I've actually been surprised, 5 years ago when we started talking about moving everything to the cloud, and now we're saying, no, you have to be ready in multiple clouds because I won't work with that company and I only work with that company. And suddenly we have to be agnostic.
Yeah. I mean, that's really the whole beauty of moving to the cloud. It shouldn't matter which one you move to. You should be able to, you should just be able to consume them. But so ask those questions and know what you're getting into. So if you know that you're with a specific cloud vendor, that's fine. But definitely ask those questions as you're going through the project. Find out where you need to be deployed to, how it needs to be deployed, and be ready.
Yeah, it's important to understand where those boxes are, because, we've been having cloud conversations forever, right? But still, the large majority of the conversations we have are around hybrid environments.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's very rare to find, especially a large enterprise, but almost anybody that's going to be 100% in the cloud.
Mm-hmm.
Even though that's where everyone wants to be, it's important to understand that you still have some of these boxes and how that's going to work. Because it tends to be quite different, one based on the cloud provider you're using, the solution, the vendor. So it's important to ask the questions.
Exactly. And then this whole concept of a trust network. So, this is a little bit more geared towards how ForgeRock has extended their platform, but the concept of being able to integrate with unlimited partners. You don't know what the next device for two-factor authentication is going to be. You don't know if it's fingerprint, iris, heartbeat, whatever that's going to be. Your solution has to be designed and built knowing that you want to plug in multiple things. You have to have the ability to integrate quickly. So, being able to understand that when you're designing it's important. And then finally, omni-channel. The days of building for a browser or a Mac or a PC, it's not there. You've got to work on any device, anywhere, anytime.
Yeah, well, we built all of our stuff for BlackBerries.
Right, exactly.
That's right.
All right, so now comes the time where I stop speaking.
Just before you go back, can you go back a couple slides? I want to just because go back to the first wheel. Okay, so what we saw was, we started with the simplify. So it was really about figuring out, how to get this down to an easy way to get started. First of all, what do we need to cover? What do we not need to cover at the beginning? Making sure, of course, everything is secure. And you talked to me then about kind of, security. I kind of put a check mark because it's kind of, we all assume it. Scaling, again, I think you have to assume like you just have to build things ready to spin up and scale as needed. And then the last thing you just talked about was extending, right? Which was about making sure that you can connect with a variety of different instances and have your application access through any kind of a device, anytime, anywhere as needed, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. And I mean, the world we play in today, it's not a homogeneous environment.
No,
it just isn't. It's very rare that we would see, 1, 2, or 3 vendors across. You're seeing dozens. Right. So being able to play nicely with others, have those hooks in place. Right. It's an important piece of the conversation.
So this is as you go out. We're going to shift the conversation a second from being how you guys handle those, but this is kind of a lesson for anybody as you go out there. Make sure that you're able to handle, figuring out what you need to be able to deliver. Making sure it's secure, making sure it can scale, and then making sure it can work with other players as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's not to oversimplify things, but really those 4 key points is what you should be looking at when you're looking at a modern identity approach. And if you use those as the building blocks, then you're going to have the foundation for success is going to be there.
Cool. All right, we'll go back to your next slide.
Yeah, so we're going to spend just a bit of time talking about ForgeRock now. So we're going to talk about our platform, the components it has, and how it fits really nicely.
Who is this ForgeRock which you speak?
I won't go into a full pitch.
Exactly.
But what we did want to do is talk a little bit about our approach, almost our design principles, right, and how that plays into the modern story.
Sure.
Right. So we have a couple pillars in the platform, and all of the pieces have been built organically within ForgeRock and not through acquisition. And that's one of the things that actually brought me into ForgeRock why I was so excited to join back when I did, was there's so much synergy between these different pillars. And it's important to understand that when you're building out these solutions. So, at a high level, we have IAM, which is our access manager, and that's the real engine that does authentication, authorization. It's the things that's deciding who has access to what and under what conditions, what time of day, etc., and how to give you that tool set to govern all those decisions, right? These big logical decision trees. And like we've been talking about before, the flip side of that is what's the gas that goes in there? What's the data that drives those decisions? Well, that's where the identity manager comes in, IDM, right? And the IDM is more of the back-end engine. It's the plumbing to say, how am I going to reach out, push, and pull the different data? How do I translate it from one system to another? How do I present a single source of truth for something that wants to integrate, right? So I've got a third-party application or someone that wants to come in and they say, I need to know everything about Damien. Well, tools like identity managers, that's what they need to be able to do. They need to be able to say, okay, I'm going to go to all my backend repositories. I know where the attributes are. I'm going to go and pull that together. I'm going to have secure policies around who should have access to it. And so, Mr. Third Party, here's everything you're allowed to know about Damien. Then you can make those decisions. And that gets fed into a policy decision, right? And it's an important piece, because a lot of our conversations, the sexier conversation around IAM is almost always around access manager, right? That's where the fun policies are, right, so to speak. But IDM is a really important piece of that conversation. And then the third sort of pillar there is, now that I have these policy decisions, I'm feeding in the great data, where do I actually store this, right? And that's where the directory is. It often doesn't get talked about until the end, but it's a really important piece. It's like I said, you need to have, based on your requirements, you look at your different data stores. Some are built uniquely for an enterprise use case. And those are the ones we're mostly familiar with, right? Where they're built and designed for a lot of reads, not a lot of writes, for example, right? You've got 1,000 employees, you're doing password binds, things like that. You're reading, you're not adding new employees in huge volume. But now you go to a more modern approach. You've got IoT use cases. You've got millions of identities. You've got maybe tens of millions of OAuth short-lived session tokens. Those types of repositories are not designed to handle that. That's where, a directory built by ForgeRock, for example, built from the ground up to support that, really starts to show its value, right? And so all these things feed into each other. And especially in today's world, where we need to have an API-driven economy, right? That's where we're working. We need to look at API-first companies, where you need to have a common REST approach to accessing these things. That's where you get a lot of value from this sort of platform approach, instead of bits and pieces from different vendors. Okay, so that's our design principle. And on the back end of everything, we say whether you want to deploy it on-prem, whether you want to deploy it in the cloud, whether you want it to be in your cloud, whether you want it to be in ForgeRock's cloud and our identity cloud infrastructure, we can handle all of that. We want that to be the easy decision. Right? We're going to go and reduce complexity. Let's talk about your use cases. Remove the dependency on engineers, developers. Those tends to be the bottlenecks, right? For a lot of our customers. Put the decisions more in the hands of, the user requirements analysts, the people who are saying, look, these are my customer experience.
Okay, so that's a good question. So realistically, a lot of times when people look at these, like, okay, I've got a problem, the first thing they want to do is hire a bunch of people to try to solve it. Right. and so I guess what you're trying to tell me is, if you know what you want to do, like, there's still a way to start working without having to hire, your engineers and stuff internally in the house.
Yeah, and we want to split that up. We want to split up this is what we're going to be coding for, away from this is what we're building. From a requirements perspective.
Right. If you had to invest, if you got one hire, and you're the city of, we're in Toronto. If you're in the city of Toronto, you get one hire. Do you hire the dev or the engineer, or do you hire the person that can figure out the use cases and what actually has to get delivered?
Our goal is the latter.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
They're the ones who build the scope and frame the requirements and really understand where you need to be. And then the path to get there, that should be the easier decision. Right? That's where
first you got to hire someone to find the money, but
that's another problem.
Luckily, I'm not involved in that type of decision. But so that's where ForgeRock's coming in. And all of these things tie into what we've been talking around context and relationships and reducing complexity. Hopefully that's resonated with people listening in today.
Yeah, and the platform that you just talked about, Keith, really, it sits, if you look at that image on the left on our slide here, it sits in the middle, and it doesn't really care whether it's your workforce, your customer, or IoT, right? The other common thing is that when you're looking at these kinds of IAM solutions, you don't want to get a siloed IAM solution that's one for SIAM, that's for our customers, and another for employees, and now we've got IoT, well, we get a third product. Really, ForgeRock has been purpose-built to be able to support all three of those models, and not just three, but as it evolves, that's where the extensibility comes in and being able to integrate and consume more as new online requirements pop up.
And especially now that you're talking around, zero trust and card and all that, analytics starts to be a big piece of the conversation, monitoring these things, right? You're tying it into your SIMs, your ArcSights, your Splunks, these types of solutions to pull this data out. Bear with me. But it's an important piece though, because I think that's another challenge we often see is say, so how do I pull data out of this so I know what do I need to scale it more? Do I need to feed this into a security product, right? For risk assessments.
Sure.
And again, a common platform really helps with that, right? Where you have a common place to say, let me pull all this analytical data. Because as we go forward, especially in the modern world, IAM becomes one of the single most important pieces to pull analytical data from for your enterprise, right? It's saying who has access to everything.
Right.
So being able to get that data and put it into some sort of log aggregator, some analyst tool, really important.
Very neat. I think we have a few questions on there, and I think I have to lean in to do it this way. All right. So let me pull up. Okay. Well, that one's an easy one. Yes, a recording and slides will be available. So that one was easy. I have a couple questions that have come up along the line. I've interrupted for most of them, but I have a couple others that. So first of all, anyone that has other questions, please go ahead and write them in. I guess we'll leave that open.
Sure.
And so. The other question I had, a couple of those actually, let's talk a little bit about IoT and where you see that going, because, you know, I've seen estimates, you know, that the number of devices that I'm going to be controlling in the years to come, I mean, it is already extraordinary, but it's going to, you know, just fly off the charts as far as those numbers and trying to keep track of that. It strikes me that the interface for me to control this is really lacking. And
as a consumer,
sorry, not as a, well, I mean, maybe as an employer as well to a certain extent, but mostly as a consumer. And I'm wondering who's thinking about that. Like, are we just going to wait for Apple to kind of run all these things in our lives, or Google? It strikes me that that's that's an interesting question.
Yeah, it's tough because it's so new age. The industry is still a lot in flux, really.
Yeah.
And even in the deployment of those devices is very different across the scheme. You know, they're still ironing out the standards that are going to be used to communicate these things, never mind security and all this type of stuff.
Now, when I look at Apple, like as an example, like they've changed their app. There used to be two apps. One was called Find My Friends and one was called locate my phone, find my phone, and they've merged those into one app. And I see that there's a rumor that they're bringing like a tile as well, so that you'll be able to attach it to your keys or whatever and help you find your stuff. And I see that as a shift towards, you know, there's now a column for me to find my kids and stuff like that because I can see where their phones are. There's one that column I can see where where my computers are, my iPad, my phone, and there'll be another one for all the stuff that I'm attached to, and presumably there'll be another now column of like my fridge and find my fridge and find out what's in my fridge, and so this is getting pretty complex pretty quickly, eh?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're going to start to see more vendors start to build solutions to help consumers. Think of it like there'll be a layer on top where they'll have a portal that you can plug into and say, give me a look at all my devices, which are independent, right?
Yeah.
It could be your iPhone, it could be your tile, it could be your fridge for your house. I mean, they're already seeing them now for smart homes.
Yeah.
You're going to see them start to extend to cars, to kids, to all that stuff. I mean, it's exciting.
Yeah.
It's going to be good.
I think it's neat, but what I find interesting is thinking about the controls on the privacy, because maybe I offer, if I'm working for you, I offer you access to my workout information because I'm looking for, a bonus, or I'm looking for a discount on my insurance or whatever.
Sure.
But I don't want to share my location all the time.
Absolutely.
Right. And so those things generally seem to come part and parcel with each other. So things are going to have to change.
Yeah. I mean, I'm seeing actually when all of these IoT and devices came out, they're making a lot of the same mistakes that we made with siloed-based applications.
Exactly.
Everything
I was wondering
being built in these silos, and slowly you're already seeing it come together now, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Google's doing a good job, Apple's doing a good job. They've realized that, okay, people, if it's too hard to adapt, people aren't going to do it. They're not going to have an application for each one of these devices. So it's merging.
We've seen it with payments. We've seen it with identity is starting to happen, or at least people are thinking about it, because I don't want to have like all these different, bank apps, and I don't want to have all these different, shopping center apps. I'm not going to put a shopping center app on my phone.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. No, like, I love the shopping center, but I'm not going to put a mall app on my phone.
Exactly.
So I'm interested to think about how these are going to emerge, and also, you know, the controls around privacy and access and being able to withdraw that access. Because, you know, it's one thing to give access. It's another thing to be reminded, you know, a month later, hey, you gave access to this. Do you still want to, you know, let your boss know where you are?
And I mean, it enables a lot of cool things too, right? Yeah. I mean, we see use cases, especially around healthcare, where you want to say, I want to, you know, this bits of my physical, I want to give to my practitioner as well as my insurance provider, and you want to be able to control that data. Yeah. But even for stores, for Christmas lists, you want to send to Santa. You know, being able to send that and control that data is important.
Yeah. Okay, so this is actually a really important question for my kids. So, like, Santa knows that if we've been naughty or nice, but who's he allowed to share that with? Right?
Exactly. Right. Who's going to control that list at the end of the day? Because it has to be really secure.
Well, we don't want to fall into the wrong hands.
Sure. Right. Sure.
And this is important. So, all right, I will show this to my kids later on today.
Perfect.
But because it's important that we're spending time focusing on things not just for adults, but for the kids out there.
Absolutely.
That care. Yeah. I don't know that we've had a conversation with Santa about who he's
sharing it with.
No,
probably not.
But I want to circle back to Richmond for a second.
Okay.
Because so talk to me. Where is that project, and where's it going? What's the next steps do you think gonna be? And how do we get the City of Toronto, which I got to be honest with you, is a little bit disparate right now, my life as a citizen here. How do we get them on the same kind of a path?
That's a great question. You know, from my perspective, Richmond is continuing to evolve. I mean, they're really happy with where they're at, but what's funny is that, you know, things are changing so quickly that that project is already starting to look outdated. Right. Okay. So the nice part about that is that they have the ability to revisit a lot of that. Everything's built on microservices, and what they're doing is they're continuing to evolve that project. They see it as being the foundation was laid.
Like, what's got evolved?
So more services. So, you know, citizens are saying, well, I don't want to have to come into an office to pay my parking ticket.
Sure.
How can I just do that online? And then, okay, well, now that I've paid that online, how do I know that my information is secure? So what they're seeing is that because of the interface has been done in such a way that the users are consuming it more, they're actually participating in evolving how my Richmond is gonna grow.
Okay.
So you know, they're actively participating with their citizens. They're listening to what they're saying to be able to evolve it in such a way that they're going to benefit their citizens, and not just what they think they should be doing, but they're actually listening to the users of the system and saying, well, what do you think? What do you actually want to see? And they've got the ability to make those changes and integrate with that.
Yeah, and nice bite-sized chunks.
Yes.
Right? They say, look, I need to be able to do my parking tickets. All right, let's look what needs to get done. And they can actually get that done. And we're talking, you know, weeks, months, not years type thing.
Yeah.
Which is a big improvement over what it used to be, but they've seen a lot of value.
And then what you're going to see, I mean, this is what their vision was, is IoT comes into it now as well. Because if you're a citizen and you roll up to a parking meter, well, who's walking around with quarters and loonies in their pocket to feed a parking meter, right? You want to walk up, you want to have your phone, the My Richmond app on your phone, just tap the parking meter and be able to pay for your parking while you're there. So those are the kinds of things that they're looking to get towards. That's the kind of evolution that we're seeing from them and from other clients. That's what they want to do. They want to make it easier for citizens to interact with them.
So recently spoke with Hillary Hartley, the CIO. Sorry, not the CIO. She's the Chief Digital Officer here in the province of Ontario. Okay. And she's the Deputy Minister associated with kind of transforming the way services are being brought to, digital services are being brought to citizens here. And one of the challenges that we were discussing was around you know, the allocation of time, because, you know, pretty much a lot of the time the government folks have to work on is almost solving problems for today, as opposed to building things for tomorrow. And, you know, they talked about things like parking tickets, not so much for Ontario, but driver's license renewals and license plate renewals and things like that, and
health card renewals, I'm sure too.
But that one's okay. My problem was with the first two, because again, figuring that if it might take several years in the current process to roll out a solution to being able to renew your driver's license online. And honestly, figuring that in 10 years, my kids are not old enough to drive yet, and I don't know they ever will get to be able to drive, because in 10 or so years, I don't know that like everyone's going to be getting a driver's license.
Own a car.
Right,
So
right.
If the driver's license isn't going to be the root identifier, and maybe we're going to have to shift to the health card or something else being a root identifier.
Right. Okay.
I could see a situation where, two things. First of all, we need to be able to have a system that's adaptable to shifting. Second of all, I could see a situation where I don't want them spending the next 4 years to build a driver's license renewal program that's going to then die, a few years after that, because it just won't be, there's no one new going into the system.
Right.
And so I think what you're talking about being adaptable is important, but the other thing is that these things got to be able to spin up quickly. Mm-hmm. If they can't, then kind of don't bother.
Yep. Yeah. The days of having projects take multiple years, that just doesn't work with like you said, with the way things are evolving now. You have to be able to roll out things quickly. And then at the same, in the same vein, when you talk about what do you hire, an architect, an engineer, someone who can pull out the business requirements. Yeah. Well, that role is critical, because that person really needs to understand, or that role needs to be able to listen to what's going on from an industry perspective, listen to what the citizens, and look ahead, right? Because they should be driving what the requirements look like, and they should be the ones saying, well, and we've got, not just do we need to do this, but it needs to be done within X amount of months, or within the next 3 weeks, or within the next, there needs to be a time frame associated with that requirement in order for it to actually be impactful. So
the ideal place we want to be is implementation is the absolute easiest part of the conversation.
Right. Yeah. How long was the implementation at Richmond?
So I think that project from start to finish was about 12 months. Okay. So it wasn't one of those roll out in 3 months, but they did have quick wins along the way.
But now that you've got that that they've got that infrastructure in place, presumably the next things that they do building upon that foundation will be faster.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Yeah.
So I guess what I'm trying to say is, does it make sense for other cities and specifically the guys in Ontario? I'm wondering, that would be helpful in the sense that we wouldn't be spending several years to build out a driver's license renewal program.
Right.
Okay. Well, we'll circle back to the folks in Ontario, and maybe they're actually watching here. So, okay, what I'm going to do right now is thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it. It's really good of you to come in person. So
it's a pleasure.
Normally I'm alone. So this is awesome. But thanks so much for coming in. Oh, and another question there. So, hey, Colleen Elliott. There you go. That's awesome. Yeah. So, that's very kind of you, Colleen. So, listen, I want to thank you very much for coming in. It's really good of you to come into town, into Toronto, down from Ottawa. Although there's some things that need to be fixed down in Ottawa too.
Yeah, I don't think we have enough time on the webinar to go through all
I'm hearing sub LRT systems.
Oh, let's not even talk about the LRT.
But anyway, listen, thanks so much for coming in. It's been a real pleasure to have you here. A whole lot more we can dive into, and we can start talking about the IoT and how to secure that down, and where how to prepare things. Most importantly, I'll take an action item to follow up with Santa and see what's going on with that list. And
absolutely,
of course, let us know.
It's a timely meeting.
Yeah. But thanks so much for coming in. We're going to post this up on so people will be able to watch it, stream it, download it from the site, and also we'll make sure that your slides are available for people to view.
Great.
We know we got a ton more people that are actually go and view it afterwards, because this may not have been the right time. So
the one thing I'd say about the slides is don't shut off after you see this last slide. There's a bunch of tools later on in the document.
Okay, so you're going to be putting an extended deck.
So it is. So we stopped here because we had some good discussions. But in the deck, there's a bunch of different guides and buyer's information. There we go. That were built for you as the clients, for you as the users, that aren't all driven around ForDrawk, right? So there's a whole bunch of guides that are available, and all the links are in the slide deck.
Help you frame those requirements that you're talking about.
Yeah. Okay, very cool. All right, so thanks very much for putting that. That's very kind of you to put together that resource there.
Yeah.
And appreciate your approach of being fairly agnostic to helping the community. So very, very good on you guys. Thanks a lot for coming in, and look forward to seeing you guys hopefully in January out in Vancouver.
Okay.
And we'll see those of you that are. I think this is our last webinar for the year, isn't it? So our next event is going to be the IdentityNORTH in Vancouver, the 16th, and no, 22nd, 23rd. Thank you very much, Alexia. 22nd, 23rd in Vancouver for Identity North and the West Coast workshop. For those of you that still have ideas or suggestions of things that we can be presenting at upcoming webinars or at Identity Northwest or in Toronto in June 16th and 17th, 17th, 18th, oh man. Please send those into us through the Identity North website. Thanks very much, everyone. I appreciate you joining in.
Thank you.